All right. So, welcome everybody. I am Maty, and I go by Don't Even Dream About It. That is my blog name. And we all are the negative mappers.
Oh
today
yeah.
we're gonna be today we're gonna be talking about one of the longest plateaus in A Thousand Plateaus, in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophical anti-treatise, A Thousand Plateaus, which goes by the full title of 1730: Becoming Intense, Becoming Animal, Becoming Imperceptible. So even this title itself can have a lot to break down. So, for example, why is it dated as 1730? What does it mean to become animal, intense, or imperceptible? Joby, I want to hear your thoughts because you have some interesting stuff wrote down.
And this is the laziest bit of formatting I did because this was meant as a note and I was meant to slot this in somewhere more appropriate. But we might as well just out and say why it's titled 1730. So in typical Deleuze and Guattari fashion, they'll just say numbers and you won't exactly get any kind of reference to what that number means. Usually you'll hear words without the etymology behind them. You'll hear phrases. You'll hear all kinds of language and what's another? I'm trying to go through the synonyms for phrase. All these linguistic phrases that are taken from other fields and other schools of study and just plastered in whole plateaus. But with 1730, what we'll find is a reference to vampirism later on in the plateau. And I did a little bit of digging, and I found that the word vampire, which can be spelled either with an I or a Y, as it first was announced, actually first appeared in the English language in 1732, because there was something of a vampire fever happening all over Europe. And in 1732, we find a publication in March, which was a translation from German of an investigative report on this guy called Arnold Powell, who was a Serbian Hajduk, Hajduk being a kind of warrior for hire. They were typically either part of a big mercenary band, which is relevant to the plateau, or they were kind of like lone wolf fighters who would just do odd jobs. And they could, depending on who was in power at the time, they are either seen as like defenders of culture or as like lowly bandits who just, made a living stealing from local people. It was usually because they fought against the Ottoman Empire. So they were either lauded as good Christian saviors or as these dirty Serbian thieves. But this particular guy, Arnold Powell, supposedly turned into a vampire after his death, which triggered an epidemic in his village of Meduagna that killed 16 people. Following which, in May, 2 months later, in England, there was a release of an article entitled Political Vampires by the London magazine, which was just some anti-Semitic political metaphor against ravenous ministers, bloodsuckers who plundered public revenues through policies of taxation long after death. The following quote is from that article, where it says, "The eastern parts from whence this account comes are much used to the allegorical style, and besides the states of Hungary are governed by the Turks and Germans with a pretty hard reign, which makes them couch all their complaints under types and parables." And this next quote is from the plateau, where this is also relevant. "Structuralism clearly does not account for these becomings, since it is designed precisely to deny or at least denigrate their existence. A correspondence of relations does not add up to a becoming. When structuralism encounters becomings of this kind pervading a society, it sees them only as phenomena of degradation, representing a deviation from the true order and pertaining to the adventures of diachrony." This should have been more situated within the text, but hopefully that was not too much to start with.
And we're going to be getting more into that as well.
Mm.
So, when one begins the plateau, the reader will immediately form a new set of questions, such as why is this plateau divided into a series of memories, such as memories of a naturalist or a Bergsonian, I think it's Bergsonist, Bergsonian, whatever, sorcerer, and eventually more abstract concepts like music and molecules and secrets is another good one. Most of these questions will surely be attempted to be answered in this lecture, but we by no means will be providing a final interpretation on the matter. This plateau is, by all accounts, a rhizome, a multiplicity, and as Deleuze and Guattari later reiterate, a hexiety. And by this we mean, this text does not call for a single or final interpretation or judgment of God, but rather invites us to play on a plane of consistency like a childish Spinozist. And there's a really cool quote, a really cool section where they say, children are Spinozist, which I think is in Becoming of a Spinozist, or Memories of a Spinozist, part 3 or something. Before getting into animals, I spelled this funny, Spinozists, sorcerers, vampires, werewolves, and molecules, let's answer the first question. Why becoming? Well, the answer is pretty simple, because becoming is fundamentally opposed to being. Being is here seen as a static category, like dead objects in a museum. To be is to assume a stable sense of coherent identity, such as the statement, I am this or I am that. Deleuze instead says that the only kind of being is becoming, or that becoming is change, flux, flow, and movement, or rather, becoming can only be seen as that which is always changing and which is always different. Do you want to read this quote, Joby? Or Joe?
Sure. The only meaningful part of this, I think, was the one is said with a single meaning of all the multiple. Being expresses in a single meaning all that differs.
Yeah, very awesome. So, just keep moving on, Cody.
Yeah, thank you very much. This you cannot be prepared properly for a plateau. You really do just have to dive in and get sticky with the language. You have to start using it more than you can actually really like prepare someone to for what the language is. But I'm glad that we did some vampire etymology because that could seem quite jarring at first when we're doing Becoming Animal, why the vampires come up. But as you read the plateau, you feel the same thing. You go, why are vampires coming up in D&G in A Thousand Plateaus? But I think it's fantastic that we got that done first because it's going to make so much more sense as we get through it. This whole difference in becoming metaphysical approach returns us to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, and we often call this process philosophy. Deleuze has in particular traced for us a series of what he calls minor philosophers who engage and create concepts for the philosophy of process, of becoming and difference. Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Bergson are the kind of main trio which Deleuze has devoted seminars and books of work to, and in them D&G find concepts and lenses of which to help form their own cartography, their own concepts and their own perspectives. In the script here, we have some beautiful drawings and diagrams by A Thousand Plateaus Illustrated. These are all up on the website, A Thousand Plateaus Illustrated. So please help yourself to these at any time, especially when reading a plateau. They've got a few plateaus already illustrated and diagrammed online. That's so helpful for just to have a visual reference while you're reading these things, because they've only got one picture and they're at the beginning of the plateau, and very rarely will you get some pictures during. And I like to say myself that when I read a book, I mean, there's got to be some pictures, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So becoming beyond representation and the genealogy of becoming animal. This plateau is named after 3 particular concepts from D&G, inspired by not only process philosophers, but also scientists, minor scientists who approach their phenomena with a methodology that differs in some ways from the major schools of scientific inquiry. They also steal from literature, film, and art. And we call this the nomadology, or nomadic style of Deleuze and Guattari, since they belong to no particular land and domain, and they are instead forming their own territory. They take concepts and weapons from anywhere there are concepts and weapons to be found. The philosopher Jörg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel refers to Wissenschaft, which we translate as science, but perhaps more accurately could just be said as knowledge, since it also incorporates fields that we don't necessarily associate with the sciences, such as Naturwissenschaften, which means the natural sciences, and Geisteswissenschaften, which means what we would call the social sciences or the humanities. And these are also the main domains across the West for the main sciences. But this can also include things like logic, and in continental philosophy would also include stuff like psychoanalysis and politics. Deleuze and Guattari find concepts and respond to Wissenschaft, different domains within and across academia. After the beginning opens of this plateau with a little analysis of a film called Memories of a Moviegoer, the plateau then starts by discussing how evolutionary and natural sciences develop their scientific methods of classifying and structuring their respective phenomena via structuralization, serialization, and what they call genetic affiliation.
Since Memories of a Moviegoer is so short, do you think we should give like the TLDR of it?
Oh god, yeah. So it's right at the beginning. It's a bit jarring because none of the sections after this mimics what this does, and this feels like Guattari wrote this when I first read it. This plateau is written in sections which are subtitled Memories of a, and there's something usually relating to the thing that they're going to discuss. So Memories of a Hexaety, Memories of a Spinozist, Bergsonian, Music, Molecule, Secrets, and so on and so on. And Memories of a Moviegoer starts off with, I can't remember the name of the film. It's a freaky film. I haven't seen
Willard.
it. I haven't seen it. But the whole point of Guattari is that in this film, he's exploring, just in typical schizoanalytic fashion, desire and what desire does, not for us when we're watching the film, but with the characters in the films themselves. He recognizes Oedipal desires, anti-Oedipal desires, connections between humans and animals, which comes up in films all the time. Often we see animal films which have highly anthropomorphized characters, animals that speak, animals that have language and have more human emotions and connections. And other times we have films that have a direct relationship and connection between a human and an animal. And this kind of sets the tone for what it is that we then want to mean when we say becoming animal. Becoming animal is not an Oedipal relationship between a pet owner and their pet. We made a joke about this before with the Oedipal pet. It's when people that have dogs. Deleuze hated this in particular, and Donna Haraway comes for Deleuze in this way, where you have people that have their small dogs and they call them their ugly spuggums and they love them so much. And Deleuze would call this an Oedipal pet or an Oedipal relation with a pet because it replicates the same the relation that person would have had with their parent, that parent would have had with them, and so on and so on.
They call them fur babies.
Fur babies, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to say about that plateau? Sorry.
I think just as the briefest of overviews, because none of us had heard about this movie before we read the book. At least I imagine neither of you two had. I didn't quite ask, but I'm not sure.
No idea.
Not sure if the movie from 1972 is like extremely popular. But essentially, the theme of the movie, it wasn't received very well either. It didn't really ever seem to even gain a cult following afterwards. So, it's one of those films. It's a B movie that's squarely within B movie territory. And it's so the film's called Willard. And the main character is called Willard. And Willard lives in a shitty, broken home with his single mother, who is a bit of a tyrant. And there's an infestation of rats in the basement, and the mother orders Willard to go down to the basement to kill the rats. But he really doesn't want to, because he doesn't want to kill the animals. And so he refuses. His mother has this vicious argument with him. And it's noted that the mother resembles a dog. Later on, the mother dies, and Willard's heartbroken. He feels like this argument has caused her early death. And his house, the one that he lives in with his mother, is being sought after by this wealthy businessman from the outside, and he's, trying to get Willard to sell the house. But Willard kind of likes it because he likes that there's the rats in the basement that he saved and that he can live with the rats now. However, the businessman is scheming. He's scheming to take the house. In fact, he's already got some papers in an office somewhere, which is he's going to, there's some subterfuge going on. He's going to try and get the house by illicit means. And so the rats with Willard hatch a plan. And Willard takes some of the rats and they go to the office to steal the papers. But the businessman catches them. And in this intense moment, the rat pack decide to kill the businessman. Unfortunately, Willard's favorite rat in the pack dies. And the rats do not forgive Willard because Willard should have been the one to kill the man, not the rats. Willard then takes some distance to the rat pack. He can't bear to hang out with them anymore. He even finds this nice sweet girl at the law firm that he works at that almost kind of, she kind of looks like a rat, and that's what attracts him to her. But Willard constantly drives away the rat pack, who are now encroaching upon him. And in doing so, he actually drives away the girl he's had this intense sort of crush on, because he's denying what he loves about her too. And you think Willard would be like, fuck it, I understand, I'm going to truly become like the rats. But by the end of the film, the rats lure him into the basement and kill him. And that's the end of the movie.
Fantastic.
And, yeah, what a fantastic movie, right? No wonder it got 42% on Rotten Tomatoes.
I think that follows perfectly into your next bit of script as well.
Absolutely. We can continue with that. So, monsters, right? The rats. Does Willard ever become a rat, or is he yet to become human? Are the rats the monsters, or are they just doing what they're doing? Monsters are at least as old as campfire, as the stories told by campfire, as the shadows born from campfire. Levi Strauss, in his study of myth, is always encountering stories like this, by which a human becomes animal at the same time as the animal becomes something else. This is part of what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as a block of becoming. Though it's possible to explain this phenomena by correspondence between the two relations, the human passing over into animality and the animal passing over into humanimality, D&G wouldn't agree. They just kind of feel like you're robbing yourself. You're taking the story quite a bit too literally in order to kind of fully get at it, in order to kind of understand. Because the myth here is always re-encoded by the storyteller. There's no way to avoid that relation. There are two multiplicities, sure, but same becoming. Oh, lovely cat.
Sorry.
Okay. But yeah, there are two multiplicities, but it's the same becoming. It's the self as a threshold, as a door. A becoming is not a correspondence between relations. Neither is it a resemblance, an imitation, or an identification. Becoming's animal are neither dreams nor fantasies. They are perfectly real. For if becoming animal does not consist in playing animal or imitating an animal, it is clear that the human being does not really become an animal any more than the animal really becomes something else. Becoming produces nothing other than itself. We fall into a false alternative if we say that you either imitate or you are. What's really real here is the becoming itself, the block of becoming, not those supposedly fixed terms through which that which becomes passes. There are no pre-existing objects. This is not like a Platonic like theory of forms. Instead, objects, subjects, and concepts are composed of nothing more or less than relations, reciprocal enfoldings gathered together in temporary and contingent unities. Furthermore, since a relation cannot exist in isolation, all entities can be understood in relation to one another. This is the point to clarify, that our becoming lacks a subject distinct from itself, but also that it has no term, since its term exists only as taken up in another becoming, of which it itself is the subject, and which coexists, forms a block with the first.
Yeah, that's perfect. I would say, like, just to add on to that, and we'll get onto this a little bit more later too. It's an involvement as opposed to a one thing changing from something else in like a series, but it's a mutual involvement or like symbiosis, right?
Mm. It's not
So
simply that
yeah,
wolves exist and there are men who literally become wolves, but something entirely different to that kind of
yeah,
direct metamorphosis.
exactly. Yeah. So just to go on a little bit more background on the plateau, Becoming Animal begins as a genealogy of different models of representation in the study of natural history. Primarily, they discuss the models of representation referred to as serial and structural. This is going to get a little bit abstract, so try to stay with me if you can. But just to kind of a little bit of a forewarning. So again, they're talking a lot about different models of representation and how those models of representation can fall short if we're only relying on them exclusively, and how it kind of prevents us from achieving new ways of seeing things if we're only looking at things in our kind of typical representational models. So the first one is a serialized model of resemblance, which could be reduced to the following formula. So 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, or a chain reaction where A causes B, B causes C, right? You can kind of see that the series structure of that is it goes from one to another to another to another. Or similarly, a series of resemblances where A resembles B and B resembles C, and this is kind of the formula. Therefore, A equals C, right? History from this perspective is very similar to some forms of theology, which begin with a first cause, which causes all other causes. So the first cause here would be God, right? A, which causes all other causes, B, C, D, and so on. And with this, all of these second and third and fourth and fifth causes and so on are imperfect deviations from God in time and space, right? There might still be some sort of eternal God who doesn't exist in time, but God in this context is seen as pushing forth chronological time. So, and kind of, I say this again here. So God is seen here as putting time into motion, so chronos, while enforcing a model of representation where God is at the top and all other things are viewed as imperfect variations of God. So that you can kind of start to see here maybe where a serialized model could kind of throw us into some kind of issues, right? So the second one is a structural model of representation. So the example that Deleuze and Guattari give is A is to B as B is to C. This is a little bit different from the first one, but this is just a method of analogy, right? So an example they give is gills are to breathing underwater as lungs are to breathing air, right? So we're viewing multiple groupings of things in the relation to each other by method of like analogy, basically. This is a type of resemblance understood by structure or analogy. So another example could be like the proletariat are to the bourgeoisie as the serfs are to the lordship. And you definitely even see this in kind of some communist literature for sure. So distinguishing from these two types of models, Deleuze and Guattari say, in the first case, or serial, I have resemblances that differ from one another in a single series and between series. A is different from B, which is also different from C, or changes into B. Or A changes into B, which changes into C. So think of how like Pokemon evolve in a series of transformations, right? This is again kind of serial. So Charmander becomes Charmeleon, which becomes Charizard. And again, change through chronological time. So furthermore, Deleuze and Guattari say, in the second case, structure, I have differences that resemble each other within a single structure and between structures. So these are kind of the family resemblances. I could keep giving more examples, but this is the kind of very similar analogy of like Charmander is to Charizard, which Squirtle is to Blastoise. So through both of these, God is seen as the third term, which allows these differences to be judged. So here's kind of where we get into this problem. So trying to escape God as the perfect first cause, Darwin's evolutionism in natural science and natural history poses a similar serialized model of representation, though. In evolutionism, we still have serialization, except now it's with small changes in genetic deviation through a process of natural selection that cause evolutionary change. So through time and small genetic differences in a series, species A becomes species B, right? Furthermore, the serialization of species change is viewed as necessarily progressive and regressive. So this is going to be another problem. Progressive when species become stronger and better adept to their environment, and regressive when they become weaker and less fit. So this is why Deleuze and Guattari say that the problem of serialization and structuralism is in no way behind us, because we're still viewing things in terms of this very different models of representation, except we've just kind of changed what fills the content. Like the form is still the same, but the content has just changed a little bit, and it's still significant. There's still important things from obviously evolutionism in science, right? But we're still in that kind of same form. So evolutionism, like theology, has a horizontal axis of alliance. So this is alliance between species and amongst species. So this is like the horizontal axis, as well as the vertical axis, affiliation or series, which is genetic change over time in hierarchy. So you can kind of see how the reason why I say horizontal and vertical is because these are changes on kind of a geographic map. So try to imagine how this change can be mapped in an evolutionary model. So the vertical axis is genetic over time, as discussed previously, whereas the horizontal axis is akin to Kropotkin's theory of mutual aid, that cooperation amongst and between species influences the survival of said species. As Nietzsche's observation that God is dead points out so well, we have not yet escaped theology so much as replaced it with a new content, which is a theology of science. The regime of signs has changed, but the way that the signs are ordered in sequence and grouped together is largely the same. Deleuze and Guattari take this observation a step further, saying that Jungian psychoanalysis finds a similar representative model in archetypes, whereas sociological structuralism models representation of symbolic understanding. So again, even going past evolutionism into kind of more modern science, we still see these same kind of models being used. In fact, much of the history of philosophy falls into some of these representational models of serial and structural. So with Deleuze and Guattari, we stop seeing things as A resembling A or A and B resembling B and C, and we start to say A goes into composition with B and becomes AB, or even difference itself populates a surface such as a formula and. Each of these ands are always different and can link unnatural participations together, which are not always filial or hierarchical. And this would be a line of flight. So we're introducing the diagonal axis here, right? For an example of alliance between species, consider the relationship of the wasp and the orchid. Deleuze and Guattari say this is a block of becoming, like Joe said. With the wasp and the orchid, they're not imitating one another, but forming a new body which is ambiguous and temporary. The wasp and the orchid are a heterogeneous block of mutual becoming. So this is symbiosis.
Another example of this would be, you guys know where figs come from, right? And you know how there is an insect which crawls into the dried husk of the fruit, and then that's the thing that gets chopped off and jellied, and then it gets put into delicious little biscuits. And so when you're eating figs, you're eating the there's always usually that larvae inside the fig. That's why figs aren't vegan, right? But they couldn't exist without the whole process of pollination and foliation in that sense. Or, if you want to think of it this way as well, truffles. Truffles are the becoming of the tree with its arborescent root system. They are the fungus itself. They are the pig involved in that whole system. And they are, your belly when you fucking nom the truffle. The whole thing is, the whole process there is the truffle, not just the distinct entity which you might, refer to as being the truffle. It wouldn't exist without any of those other bodies surrounding it. Entering into composition, entering into decomposition. A slightly easier way, perhaps, to think of it would be, has anyone here walked into an old antique bookstore or a very dusty library? The smell of old books, of all that dust entering your nose? Well, we all know that dust is dead skin cells, right? And so you're quite, so when you enter into a particularly dusty library, the person who was there 70 years ago, who shed their skin on that book, those skin cells are literally the ones that enter into your nose and touch you. And so it's almost like you're touching someone through time when you breathe in that scent. It's not that, it smells dusty, and as if dust is this exterior thing to you. It's that the whole process of time on bodies leaves its distinct mark everywhere you go.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. Its involvement, and it's kind of messy and not very, it's ambiguous, right? And how things are always affecting us and how we're affecting other things. So I'm going to keep going on.
Mm-hmm.
So if evolutionism has anything to salvage, it's alliance and not filiation, right? As Deleuze and Guattari say, and these are their words, if evolutionism includes any veritable becomings, it is in the domains of symbiosis that bring into play a totally different scales and kingdoms with no possible filiation. So again, they're trying to kind of move beyond this kind of vertical or like kind of serial model and looking more at the horizontal and the diagonal, right? So symbiosis is defined as mutually beneficial relationships between people or groups, but you could also add different kingdoms or phylum. So Joe's example is perfect here, right? On how even on like the microscopic level, like there's all these different relationships of composition and decomposition that enter into the human body and outside of the human body into the world. So you may see here a connection between Donna Haraway's idea of companion species. So Haraway says that companion species, like humans and dogs, are relentlessly becoming with or establishes a mutual becoming with one another. In addition, the dog has a complicated relationship with human history. As Haraway says in the Companion Species Manifesto, dog people, so the people who have dogs, they call them schmootrums, like to forget that dogs were also lethally guided weapons and instruments of terror in European conquest of the Americas, as well as Alexander the Great's paradigm-setting imperial travels. And they're also house pets, right? It just really depends on how the relationship is set. So you have exotic, and you also have exotic pets, such as Mike Tyson's tigers, or like My Little Beasts is what Deleuze and Guattari would call them. What Haraway takes issue with in Deleuze and Guattari is that they have a supposed hatred for house animals. As Deleuze and Guattari bluntly declare, anyone who likes cats or dogs is a fool.
Please continue, mate. Sorry.
It's all good.
I'll do something about
All good. So yeah, and you can tell how this quote is kind of almost like absurdly. It sounds absurdly like cruel to say that anyone who likes cats or dogs is a fool, right? And in Haraway's defense, post-humanist theorist Rosie Braudy says companion species like dogs, birds, and cats have been historically confined with infantilizing narratives that establish effective kinship relationships between the species or across the species. And furthermore, their inscribed status as house animals, much like animals inscribed as food animals, are all coded as such by a machine-like force of capital. However, what Haraway seems to miss here with Deleuze and Guattari's criticism is that house animals themselves, they're critiquing the familial relationship of house animals, right, that are kind of defined by humans. And especially how dogs and cats are codified within an Oedipal familial framework. So Robert Leston, in his essay detailing the Haraway-Deleuze-Guattari divide, or like kind of the one-sided argument, I would say, goes as far to say that Deleuze and Guattari say that whenever they say that anyone who likes dogs or cats is a fool, they're speaking specifically about the same people that Haraway addresses when she criticizes the infantilizing nature of dog culture. So in the first part of Memories of a Sorcerer, they define 3 types of animals: familial Oedipal, Jungian state animals, or these are like animals of divine myth, like the serpent and devil, and pack animals. So the issue with familial Oedipal animals is how animals are sorted in the arborescent structure of representation, and for state animals, how they are structured within a divine mythos of representation. So again, this is just getting back to the very similar argument set forth before of like the problems with the 2 models of representation broadly. Dogs and cats can be seen as dogs and cats can be seen as all of these types of animals of the Jungian state animals, the familial Oedipal, or the pack animals, right? But they happen to be funneled into this Oedipal framework where they're kind of treated in this kind of infantilizing way. So what Deleuze and Guattari want is a true involvement in a real becoming, one that is more molecular and ambiguous. So this is kind of why I think that, like, even with their harsh remarks saying that anyone who likes dogs or cats is a fool, they're kind of actually agreeing with Haraway that they're critiquing that hierarchical structure of pet ownership in favor of a more mutual symbiotic relationship. So I don't think what they're saying is much different. But that's a little bit more of an aside. But Cody, do you want to?
That was fantastic. This is Memories of a Naturalist and a couple of other subsections like Memories of a Theologian. I think these are the hardest sections of the plateau, and they're right after the beginning bit, which is the Memories of a Moviegoer. So you get a piece of film analysis, and then you get dropped right into this, both the etymology and history of Jungian and Freudian psychoanalysis and their models of representation, as well as the natural sciences and how they developed their methodology, how they develop their views of connecting phenomena. And then you get the post-structural. I mean, once you get this, you pretty much have post-structuralism almost down to a T of D&G, how they use the concepts of the planes of immanence, and how they use the concept of unnatural participation, the plane of nature, which get developed in Memories of a Spinozist, on how these series and serializations and structures that Maty's been talking about contributes to what we can call the theology of science, because they mimic exactly what St. Aquinas referred to as proportions of analogy, or analogy of proportion, and analogy of quality, which we use to distinguish between how one describes qualities of God. So if one says God is good, one says God is good, not like how a fox is good. They're two completely different things by analogy of proportion. What is good for God is not necessarily what is good for the fox, and the same goes for what is good for man. And the sciences, the natural sciences, and these evolutionary sciences, which develop out of Hegel, a good quote: "No Hegel, no Darwin," or in the same goes, "No Hegel, no Marx." And these are two scientists and philosophers of evolutionary progress par excellence. We're still getting, we still have theology here, and that's what these beginning subsections lead up to. We still have theology, and we still have affiliation, which just means kind of from top to bottom. So a more modern science of biology now knows about genes and how genes pass from parent to offspring, but these D&G say instead of affiliation, we want to refer to instead contagion, or the Haraway quote about companions, mutual companions, was it? Sorry?
Companion species.
Yeah, companion species. So we brought up the wasp and the orchid. I won't go too much into this. Sorry, I've just written some stuff down because it's a big. You did a lot. It's a big section. This is the hardest bit. So I want to make sure we just get into all of it really well. That the becoming wasp and the becoming orchid. Pollination is a great way to understand, instead of genes passing from parent to child, how genes also kind of pass across species themselves. The wasp and bees and pollination are a necessary part of the sexual reproduction of plants, what we call pollination, what we can also call contagion. It's not that the wasps or the pollinating insects become the fathers or the mothers of new plants, but their involvement necessarily involves becoming. It involves the creation and the production of flowers. These flowers could not exist without the wasps, but these wasps could also not exist without the plants. And this isn't filiation. This is pollination. This is contagion. And D&G invite us to move beyond the rigid, strict hierarchical views that natural science has produced, to then develop and move on to involve not just from top to bottom, but from across. And this is what we call the rhizome, a rhizomatic view, as opposed to an arborescent view, where there are only middles and connections arrive from anywhere, as opposed to a tree-like model, where there's one primary connection from the top, and this splits and divides and goes down and down and down. Thank you, Mary. That was fantastic. It's a difficult one. It's probably the most difficult. I'm glad we got it out of the way. Goodness me. Thank you for that little bit about dust, Jerry. That was fantastic. You described what we would call becoming dust, becoming smell. All becoming is molecular. As we get into later on, all becoming is molecular. It's about movements of rest and speed and relations. So as skin falls off us and over time becomes dust, that dust then gets picked up by us. We experience it as a scent, as a smell. All of these becomings are being involved at the same time. All these becomings interact and involve one another. It's not just a case of there's human skin, that's dust, and there's a human nose that experiences it, but that these two things also create new relations, new effects, what we call smells, that old book smell, and so on and so on. That was perfect little addition to a very difficult plateau. It's the longest one as well. Philosophy itself is usually split into four currents: logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics or morality. Mostly in academia, but there are also a multitude of other ways to label branches of philosophy, such as language, mind, politics, etc. So D&G take these concepts, these scientific concepts, back into their own philosophical nomadic territory and onto their plane of immanence, where they can melt down concepts, like how one melts down a cannon to make new concepts, to make new weapons. By creating a plane of consistency, which pulls the frameworks of modern natural sciences into the metaphysics and ethics of particularly Spinoza here, when we're talking about the connections between bodies, the unification between bodies, joyful and sad passions. We also now are seeing here a domain particularly known as post-structuralism, to go beyond the structures and to understand the structures of structures themselves, as Derrida says. We are responding to linguistics and we are responding to theology. So what we get then is not a series of structure and not filiation, but contagion. And this will come up again later, but this was important for the idea of vampires. Vampires function by contagion. They don't have offspring, or at least in certain mythology, it's not so much that they have offspring, but it's much more that vampires spread horizontally across. They infect. And the same thing, we could say the same thing about the relationship between the wasp and the orchid, between insects and pollination. They drain and they consume. But out of this, they also spread. They produce more of themselves. And out of this, they produce more of the other as well. It's a very weird way of seeing things. But D&G say, we use metaphors all the time, but they're not metaphors. We never use metaphors. We are stealing concepts.
In fact, we have become more aware in recent times, due to things like COVID, about the effect of epigenetics on our bodies.
Yep.
So we typically have this idea of genetics, or your DNA, are just what mummy and daddy give you, right? That's It's like they're purely there from filiation only. But actually, we know that even after you have DNA and it's floating around in your body, that your environment and that diseases can actually also attack or infect, I suppose, the makeup of your DNA. And so there can be epigenetic triggers in the environment, which then, create changes in your DNA structure in you. So not only is it something which is inherited, but it's something which is also, it's not something that's inherited and only vertically striated, but it's something which is horizontal in that sense.
Yeah. One quick example, Cody, I'm sorry to cut you off again.
Go.
But like monkeypox, right? Monkeypox isn't filial. It's very much it can cut across species in a way that even in affect DNA in a way that that is completely not filial. Basically, that's all.
That's good. That's why Spinoza is important here, because when you have different types of filiation and relations between bodies, you have some that we call joyful. They unite and develop one another. They increase one another's ability to affect. They increase one another's power. So the relationship between monkeypox and humans is not a joyful passion, one would say. It usually involves a decrease of power. It usually involves a decrease of ability to affect. We call that sad passion. Whereas pollination, we could definitely see as a joyful passion. But that's not to say that these are mutually opposed or that they're rigidly defined. In joyful passions, there will be decomposition. There will be decomposition in any relationship, and there will be composition in any relationship. How we define whether or not a thing is joyful or sad, decomposition or composition, or totally relies to us in the moment. But that can constantly change.
Totally. It's like the example of that would be somebody who goes out to drink, gets so drunk they throw up, and they're like, horrible, my night has been ruined, right? Then you get another person, does the exact same thing. They go out to drink, they come home, they vomit their guts out, and they're like, oh my God, that was an amazing night out. The sign of my head in the toilet bowl is the sign of a good evening, right?
Absolutely.
And there is no difference between those two people. It's the same sort of impetus, right? But to one, it's a joyful composition. To other, it's a sad passion, right? But there's still a similar degradation happening, or a similar positive connotation happening. It doesn't really matter. It just matters to the individual.
Absolutely. The important concept here out of this Spinozan view of relations, I mean, almost all the views of relations in D&G are Spinozan to this degree, that we're talking about bodies and their abilities to affect one another. The key ingredients that they would develop later on out of Spinoza and out of psychoanalysis is this idea of desire. Desire fundamentally has a very pivotal effect on relations and joyful and sad passions. So if one desires, typically one experiences joy, and if one doesn't desire, typically one experiences sadness, or what we call repression, and so on and so on. Thank you for those additions. They make D&G a lot better. I feel like D&G deserve a lot more experimentation and openness. But we get a lot done with this script because, goodness me, there's so many concepts that need to be defined before we can even think about discussing what it is that's going on. I'll continue with some script if that's okay, and
That's
then we'll
fine.
get to some
Yeah.
discussions soon.
Go for it.
Awesome. What we're discussing here is that all things happen on one plane, the plane of nature. But nothing natural happens here, and there is no difference between natural and artificial or between nature and artifice. Here is the plane of unnatural participation between wasps and orchids and vampires and dust. Artifice or artificium is based on ars, meaning art, and facere, meaning make or workmanship, to make art, therefore. So artificial itself means synthetic, in the sense of being man-made. Art, therefore, in this way, is also the same meaning, to be man-made. And this is, for instance, how Marx conceives of human nature, a piece of Erich Fromm's on Marx's concept of man. The concept of the active, productive man who grasps and embraces the objective world with his own powers cannot be fully understood without the concept of the negation of productivity, alienation. For Marx, the history of mankind is a history of the increasing development of man, and at the same time, increasing alienation. His concept of socialism is the emancipation from alienation, the return of man to himself, is self-realization. Alienation or estrangement means for Marx that man does not experience himself as the acting agent in his grasp of the world, but that the world remains alien to him. They stand above and against him as objects. Even though they may be objects of his own creation, alienation is essentially experiencing the world and oneself passively, receptively, as the subject separated from the object. And this is why we discuss becoming. Becoming is absolutely dealing with alienation forthright. We say that the body without organs experiences and is the experience of pure alienation. But where we add Spinoza to this Marxism is that not all alienation is equal. Some alienation we call sad passion, and some we call joyful passion. And in our last class, we delved into the relationship between becoming, body without organs, alienation, and Spinoza's sad and joyful passion a bit more. So, memories of the Spinozist and anxiety. Here we go. Goodness me. So this is how Spinoza describes sad passion in the Ethics. Marx's man is one of history, and history is a development of man himself. Human nature, as Aristotle says, man is political animal, becoming animal, we would say, who is that which makes itself out of nature and is also alienated, in a sense, from nature. Spinoza says that when two bodies collide or interact with one another, they can divide or join, split, or become one. Alienation or sad passion is becoming divided when colliding with a whole body. In the Spinoza and Marxist framework, man is produced by nature and the producer of nature. They exist on the same plane of organization, development, consistency, and they are both unique expressions of a single infinite substance. And we call this monism. And we find this in the materialism of Marx, what you can call the neutral monism of William James, and in the substance monism of Spinoza. Would you like to read this quote?
I can go ahead.
Yeah, please.
Sorry if you hear any. There's some work going on in the bathroom next door, so I apologize if you hear that.
No, it's fine.
We do be living in situations. So because I'm an asshole and I love Guy Debord, I just shove him into anywhere I can find. And obviously here it seems quite relevant, talking about Marxism, talking about Spinozism. And here he felt relevant, especially when we're speaking of alienation and how man himself sort of does not experience when he doesn't experience himself as in grasp of the world, he feels that nature is against him, even though he is a part of nature. And in this Debord quote, I guess I'll just go ahead and read it. Man, the negative being who is, uniquely to the extent that he suppresses being, he's identical to time. Man's appropriation of his own nature is at the same time his seizure of the deployment of the universe, i.e., his appropriation of his own nature is the same as his appropriation of nature itself. History is itself a real part of natural history, of the transformation of nature into man. That's directly from Marx. Inversely, this natural history has no actual existence other than through the process of human history. Now, this can be a bit mind-fucky, but I'm going to read it one more time because it's very important. This natural history has no actual existence other than through the process of human history. Okay? And what that means is that essentially what you'll find is there isn't a natural history that exists without man existing, at least not one that's relevant to humanity. There's no in Deleuze and Guattari, and I won't get too complicated with this, but in Deleuze and Guattari's terms, there are two planes. You have the plane of organization and development, which is more or less the physical world, if you want to call it that, right? You have entities, bodies acting out, they're all very physical. But then you also have the plane of immanence, which is where, almost as if the pre-written rules all exist there, that are working against the physical world, that are sort of always saying, oh, you think that's a fox? That's not really a fox. That's actually a pack of anuses. That's actually that's thunder and lightning, right? That's all stardust. And you have these two planes that are constantly in opposition to one another. This is similar to what Debord is saying here, where you have something which is which is only born of natural history, but has no existence other than itself. So I'll continue with the Debord quote here. The only part which captures this historical totality is like the modern telescope whose sight captures, in time, the retreat of nebulae at the periphery of the universe. History has always existed, but not always in a historical form. And I think that's pretty much the only important part of the quote there.
Fantastic. Definitely the vibes of Nietzsche and Marx in this little piece of the board. Man makes nature. Nature also makes man. Without man, you can't speak of nature. There's no nature to speak of. Without nature, there's no man to speak of. It's fantastic. Normally we call this a dialectic, but here we find that word just the littlest bit, reductive. Dialectic is only half the picture. Yeah, there is a relation, there's a mediation between these two things that imminently involve one another, but there is also a plurality of other voices. There is always a multiplicity. There is always an assemblage to these becomings, never just one and another. And this is what we covered in our first class on Nietzsche, Dialectics and the Riser. Thank you, Joby. That was fantastic.
No, thank you. Sorry about the work in the background.
It's fantastic. So, an evolutionary diagram or genealogy conceives of an arborescent transcendent model from top to bottom of filiation and genesis, and it specifies between the identities within a genus or family and the difference between these identities. For instance, wolves are all wolves, but not all wolves are the same. In an ethology, or an ethological point of view, which we covered a bit more in Spinoza Practical Philosophy, there is no higher identity or signifier which comes to represent all things under the same plane, but all identities and differences being or between are explored as unique to one another. All things that are being wolf, being dad, are switched to becoming. These things are always open. Nature is not immediately defined, and man is not immediately defined, but we explore both of their relations and both of their definitions in terms of each other and in terms of other things too. Hegel calls this the notion of something. A thing is always changing, always becoming more and more itself. So it's never static, it's always becoming. Father to son is still an aspect of the rhizomatic approach. There is still filiation where we are seeing connections in bodies. Oedipus and genealogy still function, but they join in a conjunctive synthesis, an and, with other forms of topology, such as between species, between behaviors, between kingdoms. In this way, a wasp and an orchid both engage in a becoming wasp and a becoming orchid. And they enter into relations with another that produce new lines of flight for each of them and for them as one. The orchid changes, the wasp changes, and both become singular unified expressions. Yet they also produce out of themselves and each other something entirely new. And they can also fail this. Failure and failures are the of becoming mark the plane of imminence as much as successful becomings do. Some becomings turn up too late. Okay, sorry, yeah, Matt, would you like to continue?
Yeah.
Say that one more time.
Yeah, sorry. I lost track of where you were talking in the script, so I was I just froze in another
Sorry.
spot.
Yeah, no, I got to your Bergson creative evolution bit.
Yep. So this is what Bergson calls creative evolution. So very similar to what Joe talked about before. To involve is to form a block or a block of becoming. So to evolve means to go somewhere backwards or forwards, right? So that's the progressive or regressive, whereas to involve, right? Not evolve, but involve means to go into composition or decomposition with something else. So as Deleuze and Guattari speculate, becoming animal does not proliferate by affiliation, but instead by contagion. So consider how vampires create new vampires, right? They're not a family of Oedipal vampires, right? There's not mommy vampire, daddy vampire, right? But they proliferate by contagion and infection. They form packs and multiplicities. Vampires may operate solo when feeding, but you can always find the crypt where they all hide together, right? Becoming animal is always a process of continual ambiguous change. So packs or multiplicities continually transform themselves into each other, cross over each other, and werewolves become vampires when they die. Love that quote. So another one of my favorite quotes from this plateau is Deleuze and Guattari say, in war, in famine, and epidemic, that's when werewolves and vampires proliferate. So what I think Deleuze and Guattari are getting at here is that the same point that Marx makes when he compares capitalism to vampires, which sucks living labor. And the more living labor capitalism converts into more capital, right? So the more that it sucks labor, the more it converts it into capital. Similarly, in war and famine, we see a similar kind of economic boom, but at the same time that capital causes war and famine, it also profits from there. And this is how vampires proliferate, right? Contagion. So becoming animal, therefore, is not a metaphor. It is a real becoming, even if the animal that human becomes is not a real animal. It is not an imitation or being, which is a false binary. Becoming is something more in flux and less stable. Becoming is ambiguous, something that folds into each other. So thing one folds into thing two, becomes AB. It is not about representation at all. In fact, it's about involution as opposed to evolution. Involution is forming a block of becoming, a multiplicity with other heterogeneous elements, and involution does not involve a thing progressing or regressing, but it's always creative, affecting and affected, infecting and infected. So again, involving. So involution is also lateral as opposed to vertical, which is kind of the form of alliance, which forms but it's also kind of has a diagonal axis, as we kind of talked about before, of becoming bigger and more powerful bodies with others. But what we become is much more ambiguous and less stable. So heterogeneous as opposed to homogeneous or homogeneous, right? Diverse intensities rather than forms.
So, I will read this next part, but I may mute myself if it gets particularly loud. So please, if you can wait for me for a sec, I appreciate it. Okay. So, nothing is more explicit than Levi Strauss's famous texts on totemism, right? Transcend external resemblances to arrive at internal homologies. So he's speaking about the animal totems that some peoples would create in attempts to create metaphors between animal spirits and human actuality, right? this would be in opposition to the structuralists' attempt at saying evolution is only dissension, it's only filiation. Absolute conformism, with which all human possibilities are identified for all time, has no external limit other than the fear of falling back into formless animality. Here, in order to remain human, men must remain the same. This next quote is from Deleuze and Guattari as well. A becoming animal always involves a pack, a population, a peopling. In short, a multiplicity. And here's a short story. The Egyptians believed that their language was that of the gods. So, one day, to prove it, they put newborns in a house far away from all society to see if they'd learn to talk, to speak Egyptian alone. They spoke that language, the language of the drills. No, they came back 15 years later, and what did they find? The kids all talking together, but bleating like sheep. They hadn't noticed that next to the house was a sheep pen. We know this when we say that the human is a social creature, and it's the same when we come to understand that we die without one another. D&G say we do not become animal without first developing a fascination for the pack, for multiplicity. Is this the Hegelian other, found outside, only later recognized to be inside? The I repeatedly finds itself outside itself. I am, as it were, always other to myself, and there is no final moment in which my return to myself takes place. And that is the only way nature operates, against itself. So if the first principle of becoming animal is pack and contagion, or the contagion of the pack, a second principle seems to tell us the opposite. Wherever there is multiplicity, you will also find an exceptional individual, and it is with that individual that an alliance must be made in order to become animal. For example here, Beelzebub is the devil, but the devil as the Lord of Flies. You won't find a lone wolf, but a leader of the pack. And Captain Ahab cannot resist becoming whale, one that completely bypasses the pod and enters into direct alliance with the unique, the Leviathan, Moby Dick. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari say, that the anomalous, the preferential element in the pack, has nothing to do with the preferred domestic and psychoanalytic individual. It's not my favorite cat of the litter. Nor is the anomalous the bearer of a species presenting specific or generic characteristics in their purest state. It's not the prime example of an animal. Nor is it a model or unique specimen. Nor is it the perfection of a type incarnate. Nor is it the eminent term of a series. Nor is it the basis of an absolutely harmonious correspondence. The anomalous is neither an individual nor a species. It has only affects. It has neither familial nor subjectified feelings, nor specific or significant characteristics. And so, what is the anomalous in this situation, right? And the anomalous here becomes the thing at the edge of the group, right? A half space from which the specific individual is separated from. The animal in the liminal borderline. You could think of it this way as you see a group of locusts who are flying seemingly at random. However, when half of them seem to go in one direction, the rest seem to follow, and vice versa. You sort of see this with hermits or witches and sorcerers who also occupy this anomalous position at the edge of the field or at the edge of the woods, right? They're pushed out. They haunt the fringes. They exist between the villages. And it's this this kind of alliance that you may enter into them with, right? You may, make the pact, go out to see the druid out in the deep of the woods, make the alliance with them when you need to. And this is a very similar kind of relation as you might see in Goethe's Faust. The Faustian deal, the sort of deal with the devil, that kind of demonic bargain. where you come into contact with the demon may grant you the wish, but there are always consequences. And this is what it means to be the anomalous. It means to be outside. I think Lovecraft applies the same term to a thing or an entity. He calls it the outsider, the entity that arrives and passes at the edge, which is linear, liminal, and yet multiple. The thing that teems, that seethes, that swells, that foams, that spreads like an infectious disease, but always just outside of eye's reach, just outside of view. You cannot look at it, you cannot name it or see it directly, but you know it's infecting there right at the border. But yeah.
Fantastic. Two concepts there. The anomaly, or what we could call the minotarian or the nomad, always on the fringe of the limits, always deterritorializing the molar or the major, always finding new lines of flight, who becomes our philosopher king, so to speak, who we can become consistent with and form a new body. They are a body which escapes, and we can either watch them wander off on their own and survive as they are, or we can join them and become a collective and form new consistent intensities. Fantastic. And I'm glad you also brought up the Faustian deal, the character of the devil. I'll only speak briefly because I want to finish up this script. We've still got a couple of sections left, so I'll try and rush through. In the Memories of a Theology section, they talk about a very powerful form of physical becoming animal. And it's in the form of possession. When people become possessed by demons, you usually find a becoming that is the direct possession of a body, the possession of a demon or a spirit taking over a physical human form. And it's only through this demonology and this sorcery that you can, and this is one form at least anyway, where you experience a direct becoming, a direct relation between a human being or one body and another body completely, the same way that a virus infects a cell, a spirit or a demon infects a human or an animal. I'm glad those were brought up. We didn't speak much on the Memories of a Theology bit, especially the demon bit, because that threw me off when I first read it, but I'm glad that it's been brought up now. ATP has this fascinating way of connecting middles always. There's no beginning and end. When you have a concept, you take it with you the whole time and you see if it works. And this was what makes them
to read.
Yeah,
this will makes them very difficult to write about, to be honest. So it was a trick trying to make notes on this, but
it warrants discussion and experimentation.
It's too interesting not to talk about.
It's too interesting not to talk about. So, vampires have a reality about them, as do werewolves. Sorcerers are those who open up these becomings between things, becoming sorcerer, and away from things, as anomalies. Here, fantasy and reality both play on the same plane, as psychoanalysis has taught us very well, and where one no longer takes ontology to be the hierarchical, the realms of more or less real reality, such as simulated, holographic, fantastical video games or real life, but we create a flat line, much like Mark Fisher's flatline construct of the Gothic flatline. Since here non-fiction and fiction take place on the same plane, in the same way that Spinoza's fall and extension take place on the same plane. Becoming is not an imitating, it's not a mimesis or representing, it is ambiguous. Becoming itself becomes. One is never sure what one is becoming. Becoming vampire here also means infecting. Becoming animal means exploring the molecular relations and effects available on the plane of immanence. They say one does not bark like a dog molarily. God, I don't think that's right. With molarity, but one can express molecularly the particles of a dog bark and experience those same relations of movement, sound, and speed. Becomings are foldings and flattenings. They are expressions of multiplicity, of individuated assemblages colliding into one another. We also call this a composite. A body is not one, it's a form or it's a shape given to something, but what that thing is made of a further infinite series of parts, smaller bodies that make it up, in the same way our body is made up of blood cells, skin cells, and so on and so on.
And we shouldn't fall into the trap of just thinking, well, why don't we go down to the smallest body, the atom? Because that's not quite the point. The point is not, oh, we have all these infinitely smaller things within us. No, the body itself is part of an infinity of wider things across, again, horizontal axes, diagonal axes. So it's not just about turning inwards and finding the smallest possible unit of measurement from within. Because otherwise we're just falling for the trap of like naming being, right? We're just falling for that trap again. We're just saying, oh, but we're made up of cells, or which are made up of atoms, which are made up of quarks, which is just listing these dead static bodies, which you're not really made of. We're made of movements. We're made of relations between speed and rest. We're not made of these, You're not thinking truly about the 20 trillion cells in your body, like in a 2D image.
Yeah, here size does not matter, only what it can do, right?
Oh, babe.
Hawking says this. I'll let Maty finish off for their next bit of the script and continue. Hawking says this idea called quantum cosmology, which, to replicate what Joey says, is when if you go down to the most infinitesimal part, you will find there a whole cosmos. The entire universe, again, back in the form of a single point. Every single infinite point comes to represent the infinite, and we call that quantum cosmology, which I think is a fantastic term for what we're explaining. And Guattari gives off the same vibe with what he calls the cosmos or chaosmosis. So thank you very much.
Happens next too. So becoming mostly happens on the molecular level via imperceptible changes within oneself and between others. It is always a becoming with, like kind of what Donna Haraway says, right? An involvement, a haxiety. So the proper name of a person doesn't designate a single entity or a singular identity, but a shifting set of lines that are always moving. And it is in this way that the proper name of like something like Hurricane Katrina is not very much different from Dionysus. So the proper name merely refers to the event, much like the Mississippi River refers to the event of the river, despite the river always being in perpetual flow and movement, right? So the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus says famously, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is the same river, and he is not the same. It is not the same river, and he is not the same man." So by this, he meant that the proper name of the river and the man are both events which are given a proper name kind of at a convenience, right? Because we need some way to talk about them. They are rather verbs, actions, and becomings, as opposed to nouns, which represent beings rather than becomings. So we miss the entire picture if we're only looking at the river as a form of being, right? In the same way that we're kind of missing the whole picture of like the human or Heraclitus or Hurricane Katrina, if we're thinking of it as something that's being, but it's really something that's becoming, and it's its own kind of event throughout a given duration. So Deleuze and Guattari say, and this gets kind of strange, so bear with me. So the he, so that you could also exchange any set of pronouns here, does not represent a subject, but rather makes a diagram of an assemblage. This is why they are both so interested in sentences with an indefinite noun, which is a noun that does not specify a specific thing, proper names, so, name of a person, place, or thing, and the infinitive verb. So a verb which usually begins with the word to, so to do something, to become, to die. So here's an example of this kind of sentence. It's really interesting. So if this doesn't kind of stick, it's okay. A Hans to become horse, a pack named wolf looks at he, one to die, wasp to meet orchid, they arrive Huns. You could also think of classified advertisements like dishwasher needed, right? So these are really weird sentences because they don't necessarily refer to anything in particular. So all of these statements suggest relationships without having to specify particular bodies. Or in other words, it does not overcode statements. It does not transcend them as do the first two persons. On the contrary, it prevents them from falling under the tyranny of subjective or signifying constellations under the regime of empty redundancies. So, for example, it is different to say the child Hans becomes a horse versus a Hans to become horse. The way those sentences work are different even if the content seems similar. So it would be a huge mistake to say that a river doesn't move or that a hurricane is static, and the same thing goes for the human. So, except that for the human may become involved into the event of the river or the event of a hurricane, either floating on a gentle stream or being thrown into a violent disaster. And it's in the same way that even I'm not actually, never mind. So folding and unfolding is how bodies affect and are affected by one another. So again, we're talking about symbiosis here.
I mean, if it would be okay to jump in just before Cody goes ahead, not to make the talk longer, but I feel like the hexaety sort of warrants a little bit more exploration because it's such an interesting concept. Essentially, hexaeties are bodies that are not defined by the form that they take, nor as determinate substances or subjects, or not even by the organs that they possess or the functions that they fill. So on the plane of consistency, you'll find that the sum total of any entity, all its material elements, belong to it under given relations of movement and rest, or speed and slowness, which might sound like gobbledygook, but essentially you only get intensities on the material realm, right? And this is that there's a mode of individuation or a specific becoming block of speed and rest that is different to that of a person or a subject or a thing or a substance or a concept. And this is what we call a hexaety. And hexaety is a really interesting word. I'm actually just going to Google again quickly the etymology of this word, because I think it comes from Greek.
Medieval.
Yes.
I thought it was medieval.
Oh, it is, yeah. It's a medieval scholastic term referring to the property or virtue of a unique, indescribable thing. And so a very easy example of this would be an hour or a season, or
the weather, I think.
Weather, yeah, absolutely. So I know Charlotte Bronte in her literature, she describes everything in terms of the wind, right? She describes things, people, faces, loves, and words in these terms, right? She says that I think there's a term in one of her works called 5 in the evening, which is the time where love falls and fascism rises. Obviously, that doesn't happen every 5 in the evening, but the specific 5 in the evening she's speaking about is the thing that really matters here. Hexaeties, I think the only important thing to recognize of hexaeties are that they have neither a beginning nor an end. They don't have an origin and they don't have a destination. You're always caught in the middle. How can you say for sure that you are at the very start of a thunderstorm, right? You never are. You're just kind of caught in the middle of the thunderstorm. It's not made of points, only of lines. It's a very rhizomatic experience to be suddenly caught up in weather, right?
Yeah, exactly. Hexae comes from one of Deleuze's favorite theologians, Duns Scotus. And in the logic of sense, he does this very linguistic thing, like we've done with the sentences with the hexaety. He says you want to turn nouns into verbs. Nouns are illusory because they point to a thing, they point to a being, whereas verbs express the very movement of becoming that we're trying to talk about. So when he says a tree is yellow, you want to think more a treeing, particles that enter into relations of what we could call the hexaety of the tree, the substance of the tree. Yellows enters into relations of yellowness. Neither yellow nor tree are static things, but what we're referring to with these nouns are movements of particles that enter into relations of speed and rest that come to represent what we experience phenomenologically as yellowness and treeness. Thank you for bringing hexaety up. It comes up a lot in the ATP, not just this plateau, but pretty much across the whole text. And I think it gets developed the most in Deleuze's logic of sense, which is something we have yet to cover, but hopefully we get to one day. I'll continue on with a little bit of script if that's okay. But thank you very much for those additions. They're fantastic. They really help out what's actually going on here.
I just think hexaety is such a beautiful word that it's like such a shame that it gets such little representation in this talk as we wrote it.
Because it's theological. So the same way that we're saying that science fails because it reproduces theology, Deleuze was also going, but there's also some parts of theology that go beyond itself. There are some parts of theology that are actually so fantastic that we need them into our language today to really explore what's going on or what can happen.
Yeah. I mean, just like evolutionism, sorry, last point for me is evolutionism has alliance, and Kropotkin shows that with like the idea of mutual aid and like cooperation between and amongst species. So I think,
I think, and this will be my last point as well, there's another point here about psychoanalysis and how children are natural Spinozists, and we can use hexaety to describe this. When a child says something along the lines of, "Oh, a horse," or my stomach, or where do babies come from, or someone is beating a child, a therapist or a psychoanalyst will hear that and say, "Your belly, your father. Will you grow up to be like daddy? Who's being beaten by who?" So the therapist is always making it about the specific, about the definitional, whereas the child only ever sees the infinitive. The child is only ever using the language of the infinite, whereas it's the psychotherapist's job to make it all forced back into regression. It's the psychotherapist's job to or the psychoanalyst's job, to particularize the entirety of the child, which is really unfair to what the child is trying to breach across.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is another example of how children effortlessly understand hexaeties, and then we seem to kind of lose this as we form relations to grammar as we grow older.
Children, Spinozists, nomads, schizos, the minor. These are all the different types of subject that we could describe who are more hexaeties, who are more events that do experimentation, that do what we describe as Deleuzian ethics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, script time. Sorry, everyone. Okay, so many cultures through history have had a theology or mysticism which involved insects and animals in the origins of humanity into their genealogy, or as beings which represent an important relation for human beings, such as Egyptian and Hindu animal gods that take animal forms and can shapeshift. Even modern-day alien theorists look at historical examples of beings representing bees, praying mantises, biblical angels, where the alien has now become a sort of modern-day stand-in for what we call the god of the gaps. God of the gaps being an epistemological term where if there was something that could not be explained, typically God would fill the gap. If you watch Ancient Aliens, though, you'll come to find that they do exactly the same process. They find religious phenomena, spiritual phenomena, and instead of saying this is God, they instead say this is extraterrestrial life. This is aliens, and it's fundamental proof of alien life. But they have to say that to get their budget, which is fantastic. Alien, God, magic. These terms have been used to designate a type of becoming which is unearthly, inhuman, other, ineffable. These do not undermine their reality, but they underpin it. It is not the words themselves that matter. It's not the signifiers or the language games, but it is the activity, the affects, the productions, the signified, which are full of life. The 10 plagues of the book of Exodus, God's justice, the plague of locusts. This is God's becoming locusts and the locust becoming God. Whether an actual event or merely a description of an event, there is still a becoming. Either in these are two not distinct modes. They are not two different types of being. They are a hexaity. They are unique expressions of the same thing. One can become God, become alien in both thought and expression, since these are two attributes of the same substance, the same infinite, immanent substance we call Deus sive natura, God or nature. And these condense onto the same planes of nature and immanence and interact with other planes of consistency and development. First they are intensities, and then they are extensive. Mythology and logos, mythos and logos, here are on the same plane. Post, past, and future are on the same plane. Reality and fantasy, bugs and gods and people, mountains and rivers and mothers, evolutions and involutions. We are already animals, gods, and aliens. We already have them, or can have them, and can become them.
Yeah, and another example that I really like is from the band, or the group, Diggable Planets. They're a hip-hop group from the 90s, and they rapped about bugs, planets, and galaxies as being expressions of infinite variation on a differing cosmic scale. So very Spinozist, but they're also Maoist. So that's cool. Butterfly says, every man's a planet and the props are there to get it. Insects roll together with the spirit in our orbit. Listen to the song. It's pretty dope. But whereas Deleuze and Guattari say children are Spinozist because they view things in terms of speed and movement, capacity for affecting and being affected. So Diggable Planets say we're all just babies, man, which means we're all infinitely small as bugs are, but also contain multitudes as planets do. So it's really just a matter of what scale you are viewing a body in its relation to others. That kind of matters here, I think.
Yeah, size here doesn't matter. Guattari calls this cosmic spasm. You don't know where we don't have a real referential system for scale. We only have the arbitrary one that we experience. But when you understand everything from the point of the middle, there is no more bottom or top. There's no more tiniest and largest, but the tiniest becomes largest and vice versa. I'll try and rush through so we can finish the script and maybe get a little bit of discussion about this plateau with everyone at the end, get some questions going.
And in fact, I was going to ask, do we want to go through 5 and finish at 6, or do we actually want to stop before 5?
There's not that much left in 5, and 6 is where Jack was going to talk, but he's not here, so it's fine.
No problem, then. By all means.
We can record 6 another time and add that to the end. We'll just get through 5 and then we're finished
we could
pretty
do
much.
A part 2 as well,
Sure.
like Joe thought of too.
What was it? Sorry.
We could do a part 2 and like maybe go in deeper on like some of the other
concepts.
We'll
talk about that afterwards. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Word. Sorry.
No, that's fine. To just absolutely jump into something completely random again. Aliens breed, probe, and aliens experiment on humans, much like how humans breed, probe, and experiment on animals. Gods, aliens, humans, animals experiment on nature. Nature is a surface like a desert, populated by tribes and bodies, and so is the body of the schizophrenic, of the nomad. On it are purely unnatural participations. Unnatural kinship, we could call it. So now for becoming imperceptible, something that's come up a little bit in terms of molecularity, but we'll now get into something as its own concept. Becoming imperceptible means becoming ambiguous, becoming unrecognizable. To be imperceptible on invisibility and imperceivability, and you're still real and existent despite not being perceived. Many have this argument for God when they're young. If I can't see him, how can we say he's there? But you'll receive many different answers to this, such as why do you need to see it to believe it? You don't need to see gravity for it to be a real principle. And here we have the distinctions between precepts and concepts, ideas and empirical observations and stimuli. Becoming imperceptible means that one escapes their look and can no longer be represented by their appearance or form. If one is perceptible, others can make sense of you, pin you down, which also opens you up for manipulation. When someone can make you out, they can find it possible to create their desired outcomes out of you. They can maneuver the situation and you to meet their own needs and ends. Imperceptibility leaves others blind. You express something other than that to which you have been formally categorized as being of. In the same way, a binary gender essentialist may pin down to the being of a woman as having certain chromosomes or genitalia, or perhaps even expressing certain behavioral characteristics. The stereotypes of the bad driver and the hysteric come to mind. Perception is therefore always multiple and involves groups of peopling of others. It is not only how one perceives themselves, but how others perceive of themselves. And these perceptions involve their own layers of internal perception extended outwards into the world, biases and cognitive confirmation. Becoming imperceptible means losing oneself, and therefore not having a self which can be captured by identity. You cannot be pinned down to anything or anyone because one is always multiple, schizophrenizing. To lose oneself is to prevent others from finding you.
So just to talk a little bit more on becoming imperceptible, I would say it is the sorcery of abolition through proliferation. I'll break that down. So there's an idea of xenofeminism which calls for the idea of post-gender scarcity, or gender post-scarcity, sorry. This doesn't necessarily mean to lock down a million different static identities which perfectly describe oneself, but it is instead to make gender so multiplied that it is completely unrecognizable by language. So this would be the becoming imperceptible of gender, right? If we're looking at the ideas put forth by xenofeminism. So
we've all seen the shitpost, which is like, yeah, I identify as a post-Reaganist, molecularist, min-maximalist, Maoist, Spinozist. It's just like all these buzzwords that pile on top of one another like a German word. And, you tune out after about the second buzzword you barely make sense of. But it's almost like this is the kind of theory behind that. This is like the whole, if everything is nothing, then wouldn't that be fantastic? Wouldn't you have such a background to paint with?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I think it kind of makes a joke out of the of proper names, basically, in a pretty clever way, I would say. Into that it kind of points to how like a proper name doesn't necessarily designate the being of a thing, but the shifting lines that the proper name can temporarily like point to, which is already moving by the time you say it out loud, right? So just to kind of keep going with the script, this is why Deleuze and Guattari say that all becomings are molecular and that all becomings pass through a becoming woman, which also gets some criticism from, I think, Donna Haraway. In Eugene Holland's Guide to A Thousand Plateaus, he explains that becoming woman does not refer to someone designated by power as male or female that becomes woman by imitation or even like a Butlerian performance of a Muller form of woman, but rather the inverse, that one becomes woman or passes through becoming woman by destratifying gender roles which undermine both man and woman as Muller forms. So we're seeing the breakdown of Muller forms through molecularity. Or in other words, becoming woman creates lines of flight which escapes state codification, whereas Muller forms of man and woman stratify and rigidify gender and sex as binary categories. A lot going on there, but you can kind of also think of like de Beauvoir's kind of famous quote of one is not born but becomes woman. I think that Deleuze and Guattari are very much speaking on a very similar point here. to pass back.
There's actually a sorry to interrupt. There's actually a quote by Andrea Long Chiu from her book Females, which is, "Everyone is a woman and everyone hates it."
Yes. Yeah. So to pass back through the molecular means to be involved with the process of everything else. So to become molecular doesn't mean to become small, right? But it's to become imperceptible. So to move through the middles of things. So another Holland quote is that becoming imperceptible is achieved by eliminating all forms of organization, signification, and subjectification standing between our desires and our perceptions, that they correlate precisely, thus enabling us to launch forth from home on thread of a tune to improvise with the world and ultimately to meld with it. Rosie Browdy calls this becoming world or becoming earth, which I fucking love. So this isn't to become a homogeneous mass, but a sea of difference, right? So whenever we say to become world, to become earth, we're not like saying that like this kind of like earth where everything in it is exactly the same because it melds into each other. It's not like an American melting pot that people will talk about, right? But it's a homogeneous sea of difference where which is a lot different, where things are different. So the point is not to be captured by a regime of signs which sorts us into this or that identifying marker. Like Kierkegaard says, once you label me, you negate me. So once you are given a proper name or assigned a pronoun or are placed into context of class society, you are atomized or individuated from your fellow hexeity. So in this context, I would say I lose my ability to become a werewolf, to participate in the event of the weather, or to form my own event with others. So there's kind of this double bind of labeling through language, I think, that we're kind of trying to hit on here. Perhaps we should only use proper names in order to parry to them. And the purpose of becoming imperceptible doesn't mean to become atomized or given a singularly small territory of power, but to participate in an ambiguous river of becoming world. So just kind of wrapping up this last part for my part, Simone de Beauvoir was right to say that one is not born but becomes a woman. So naming this thing called being is always a retroactive and reductive act, right? You can only be named something after the fact. So to become imperceptible isn't to become small, it means to become ambiguous, just like de Beauvoir says. To dwell within so as to experiment with the lines we are dealt and to keep breaking them down, or to force the lever.
I'm glad that Andrea Long Chiu's Females was brought up, because it posits the exact kind of dialectical opposite to where Guattari stands on women. Guattari being the student, of course, of the psychoanalyst Lacan, who is probably in their psychoanalysis of what's called sexuation, has a couple of famous phrases, one being there is no sexual relation, and the other being la femme n'existe pas, or there is no such thing as woman. For him, what we call feminine desire or desiring of the woman is purely the realization of a subject that knows themselves to not truly exist except as a signifier that exists for the other. Women only exist in the gaze of the man. And it's in this gaze of the other, of the male other, that woman becomes a signified subject. But female desire, a woman that knows themselves to be this male gaze, knows that they can go beyond this, that they don't actually exist in this form. That they are what you call a Parisian veil. They hide nothing. There is no secret to them. And this is how becoming women works here. Oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah.
I was going to largely agree and say there's one subchapter of the Plateau we didn't touch upon, but it was called Memories of a Secret. And I'm not going to go fucking look it up right now. I'm just going to try and paraphrase as best I can. But there's a line within it that says, why is it that women are seen as holding secrets when they have nothing to hide?
Fantastic.
Which
Yeah,
talks-
exactly.
Yeah, the transparency of like, you know, being referred to as female in this relational world.
It's a very Lacanian point. The
Mm.
being who has something. Chevoir. What is it that you have that I don't? What is it that
Mm.
you're hiding from me? When the real Lacanian answer is there is nothing to hide. There was
Mhm.
never anything to hide, except the fact that you thought that there was. The
Yeah.
secret is that there is no secret.
Mm-hmm. And this is this is in opposition to the sort of masculine, and I say this with like tongue in cheek because I hate the terms masculine and feminine, but it's in opposition to the masculinizing secret, which is the like, you know, stoic warriors like, oh, I would take this to my grave, and his secret is that he's like, I just really like feet, and he fucking dies with it. And he keeps it as if it's this whole secret that wasn't really ever anything, you know, and all the schizophrenics and all the children and all the women point and laugh.
That's fantastic. Foucault has a fantastic quote on this becoming imperceptible, no secrets to hide point, where he says about, why should I go about defining myself? Why should anyone go about defining themselves when surely the point is to find out?
Yeah.
That's exactly the case here. There is no secret because whatever it was is changing. And by the time we've pinned it down, it's already moved. And we're back to having players once again.
I'm sure Foucault also said something along the lines of, you know, something to the effect of, why is it that when you're gay, you come out, but like obviously straight people never come out? Like,
Right.
why is this process of coming out sort of delegated towards those who are deviant, right? As if they're the ones who need to come forward, step out the shadow. Like as you said with Foucault, it's like we're all finding out. It's a constant becoming. We're never sure of why is it that we have to extract the finest of secrets from a shadow, which is kind of paraphrasing something Foucault said at one point. But you know, we hate citation here.
So not to cut off anything, but maybe we could finish up just there's like only a few more points.
Yeah, it's this final paragraph, isn't it, from Cody?
Yep.
Okay.
To come out and deliver yourself.
Yeah, Foucault discovered heteronormativity for us and molarity that we can now work against. He discovered power, which functions by hiding. As soon as you reveal it, it no longer functions. So, and this is the critiques that they have, both Deleuze and Foucault and Guattari, of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis says, find yourself. We say, keep exploring your bodies without organs. It also means opening up one's own perceptions, both how one interacts with the world directly and how one comes to recognize and perceive the world. Becoming scientist means both entering into relations of the scientist, opening up one's thoughts and imaginations to that of science and the scientist, and also of creating science. These all happen on the same plane, on the same surface, on the body without organs. One doesn't imitate a scientist, but becomes scientist, changing both the scientist and the non-scientist as they open and fold into one another through either sorcery or demonology. Becoming imperceptible means to no longer need to see what is happening, but only to participate, to become a hexaity, a riser, to explore, become world, and not to find anything, and of having nothing to be found, which always comes later or after the fact.